In 1952, a man in Mingo County, West Virginia, dug a single root out of the hillside and sold it for more than his neighbor made in a week at the coal tipple. That root was wild ginseng, and it was just one of dozens of ways mountain people kept the lights on when the paycheck ran short. Number 14 on this list paid for more school books than any government program ever did. And number 3 involved a skill so valuable that families guarded it like a secret, passing it down only at the kitchen table after the children went to bed. These were not hobbies, they were lifelines. Before we start, hit that subscribe button, because most of these side hustles still work today, and nobody is talking about them. Let us count down the 20 forgotten ways Appalachian folks used to pay the bills. Number 20, selling Galax leaves. Before the floral industry went synthetic, Galax leaves were green gold in the mountains of western North Carolina and southwest Virginia. Families hiked into the deep woods with burlap sacks slung over their shoulders, picking the glossy, heart-shaped leaves by the thousands. Florists in New York, Philadelphia, and Atlanta paid good money for Galax because nothing else held its shape and color as long in funeral wreaths and table arrangements. A good picker could gather 5,000 leaves in a day, earning between $8 and $15, depending on the season. Real money in hollows, where a gallon of milk cost 35 cents. Children learned to pick before they learned to read cursive, their small hands sorting the best leaves from the bruised ones, while mothers bundled them in stacks of 25, wrapped tight with rubber bands. The smell of damp earth and crushed greenery clung to their clothes long after they came home. By the early 2000s, over-harvesting and permit restrictions thinned the trade. But for decades, Galax money bought Christmas presents, paid light bills, and kept families fed between coal checks. The leaves are still out there. Most people just walk right past them. Number 19, fur trapping. When winter settled hard on the ridgelines, trapping season meant survival. Men and boys set steel-jaw traps along creek banks and ridge trails, checking them before dawn with lanterns that threw long shadows through the bare trees. Muskrat, mink, fox, raccoon, and the occasional bobcat brought steady money at the fur buyer's truck, which rolled through small towns on a schedule as reliable as the mail. In the 1950s, a single mink pelt fetched between $15 and $30, enough to cover a family's grocery bill for 2 weeks. Muskrat brought less, maybe $1.50, but they were plentiful, and a skilled trapper could pull 20 in a week. The work was cold, brutal, and lonesome. Hands cracked and bled from the water. Boots froze stiff overnight. But when the fur buyer counted out bills on the tailgate of his pickup, that money went straight to the hardware store or the doctor's office. Fur prices collapsed in the 1980s when animal rights campaigns shifted public opinion, and overseas fur farms flooded the market. The trap lines went silent. The creeks still hold mink, but the buyers stopped coming. Every front porch in southern Appalachia had at least one chair with a woven seat, and the person who wove it earned a living one chair at a time. Chair bottoming, also called chair caning or seating, used strips of white oak, hickory bark, or river cane to create the woven pattern that turned a bare wooden frame into something worth sitting on. A skilled bottomer could finish a chair in 3 or 4 hours, charging between $2 and $5 through the 1960s. The strips had to be split by hand, shaved thin with a draw knife, then soaked in water until pliable enough to weave without cracking. Women did this work as often as men, sitting on their own porches with a pile of damp strips and a half-finished seat in their laps. Neighbors brought broken chairs the way people today bring phones to a repair shop. Word of mouth was the only advertising needed. As cheap imported furniture flooded department stores and discount chains, the demand for hand-bottomed chairs dried up. The craft survives in folk schools and craft fairs now, but the days of earning rent money one seat at a time are gone. In the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia, Families who did not work for the company still found ways to heat their homes and earn a few dollars from the black rock. Coal gleaning meant picking up the chunks that fell from railroad cars, tipple belts, and slag heaps, gathering what the mines considered waste. Women and children walked the railroad tracks with buckets and wagons, eyes scanning the gravel for pieces big enough to burn. A wagon load of gleaned coal could heat a cabin for a week or sell to a neighbor for $1. The work was dirty and sometimes dangerous. Railroad companies technically owned the fallen coal, and mine guards chased gleaners off company property when they felt like enforcing the rule. But most looked the other way, understanding that the alternative was families freezing in January. By the 1970s, mechanization and stricter regulations ended most gleaning. The coal still falls from the trains, but the people who once depended on it found other ways to get by, or moved away entirely. Long before pharmacies appeared on every corner, the forest floor was the medicine cabinet. Appalachian folks dug bloodroot, yellowroot, black cohosh, and slippery elm bark from the hillsides, and sold them to herb buyers who supplied pharmaceutical companies and natural remedy distributors. Bloodroot, with its brilliant orange-red sap that stained fingers for days, fetched between $3 and $8 a pound, dried in the 1960s. Yellowroot, pulled from creek banks and washed clean of mud, brought similar prices. Families knew the spots the way fishermen know their holes, returning to the same patches year after year, careful to leave enough for the plants to regenerate. Grandmothers taught grandchildren which roots to pull and which to leave, knowledge passed down as quietly and deliberately as a family Bible. Herb buyers set up at country stores on certain days, weighing roots on hanging scales and paying cash on the spot. The trade declined as wild populations shrank and regulations tightened. But in remote hollows, root digging still puts gas in the truck when nothing else will. The smell of leaf soap cooking in a cast iron kettle could strip the nostalgia right out of your memory. It was sharp, acrid, and unmistakable, drifting across the yard on wash days and soap-making Saturdays alike. Appalachian women saved kitchen grease and meat drippings all year long, storing them in coffee cans and lard buckets until they had enough to make a batch. They leached lye from hardwood ashes by pouring water through a hopper, then combined the lye water with rendered fat in precise proportions passed down from their mothers. Too much lye, and the soap burned skin. Too little, and it would not set. A single batch yielded 20 or 30 bars, enough to keep the family in washing soap for months, with plenty left over to sell or trade at the general store. A bar sold for 10 or 15 cents through the 1950s. Pocket change that added up. Country stores stacked homemade soap next to the canned goods, and customers swore it cleaned better than anything from Procter & Gamble. Commercial detergents killed the trade by the 1970s, but the recipe lives on in every family that kept Grandma's notebook. Number 14. Selling eggs and butter door to door. The egg and butter route was the original subscription service, and it kept more Appalachian families solvent than any bank ever did. Women gathered eggs each morning, washed and sorted them by size, then packed them in cardboard flats or old egg cartons saved from the store. Butter was churned by hand from cream skimmed off the morning milk, shaped into rounds, or pressed into wooden molds carved with flowers or wheat sheaves. Twice a week the farm wife loaded her car or wagon and drove a regular route through town, delivering to the same customers who expected her at the same time on the same day. A dozen eggs sold for 30 to 40 cents in the early 1960s. A pound of butter brought 60 cents or more if it was good. The income was modest but relentless, arriving every week like a paycheck that never bounced. Some women built routes of 50 or 60 customers, earning more than their husbands made at the sawmill. The trade faded when supermarkets undercut local prices, and health regulations made unlicensed dairy sales difficult. But for decades, egg and butter money paid for school books, shoes, and the electric bill. Every fall, the sorghum mill drew families together like a church supper. Farmers planted patches of sweet sorghum cane in the spring, tended it through the summer, then stripped and cut the stalks when the seeds turned brown in October. The stalks were fed through a horse-drawn or mule-driven press that squeezed out the green juice, which was then boiled down in long copper or steel pans over a wood fire. The process took hours. Someone had to skim the foam constantly and adjust the fire to keep the syrup from scorching. The smell was extraordinary, sweet and earthy, and heavy enough to taste on the back of your throat from 100 yards away. A gallon of finished molasses sold for $1 to $1.50 in the 1950s, and a good patch of cane could yield 30 or 40 gallons. Families who ran the mill took a share of every neighbor's batch as payment for the pressing. Sorghum went on biscuits, into gingerbread, over cornbread, and into baked beans. The mills fell quiet as cheap corn syrup and refined sugar took over, but the few that still operate draw lines of customers every autumn. Number 12. White oak basket weaving. A white oak basket made by Appalachian hands could outlast the person who bought it. The craft began with selecting the right tree, a straight white oak no more than 8 inches across, felled and split into bolts, then pounded and pulled apart along the growth rings into thin, flexible strips called splits. The process demanded strength, patience, and a feel for the wood that only came with years of practice. Basket makers shaped egg baskets, market baskets, hampers, and fish traps, each form suited to a specific task on the farm or in the home. A well-made egg basket sold for $1 or $2 at the general store in the 1950s. Larger hampers and market baskets brought more. Families known for their baskets built reputations that traveled across county lines, and regular customers placed orders months in advance. Children sat beside grandparents learning to pull splits and weave bottoms before they were old enough to swing an axe. The craft nearly died when plastic containers and cheap imports arrived, but it survives today at craft fairs and folk schools where a single handmade basket now sells for $100 or more. The irony is thick. What once paid the light bill is now a luxury item. In the mountains of western North Carolina and parts of Virginia, mica flashed in the hillsides like buried mirrors. Small-scale miners dug it from shallow pits and outcroppings, prying apart the thin, transparent sheets that the electronics and insulation industries needed for capacitors, furnace windows, and heat shields. A pound of high-quality sheet mica could fetch several dollars in the 1940s and 1950s, and families worked small claims on their own land or leased mineral rights from neighbors. The work was backbreaking. Miners used picks, pry bars, and bare hands to extract the delicate sheets without cracking them, then sorted and trimmed each piece by size and clarity at the kitchen table. Women and children did the sorting, their fingers learning to feel the difference between book-quality mica and scrap. Buyers from Asheville and Spruce Pine made regular rounds, paying cash for sorted sheets. The domestic mica industry collapsed when cheaper imports from India and Brazil undercut Appalachian prices in the 1960s. The old pits are still visible on mountainsides, shallow scars in the red clay where families once scratched out a living, one glittering sheet at a time. Firewood was the original cash crop in the mountains. A man with a truck, a chainsaw, and a strong back could earn a living from October to March without asking anyone for a job. Families cut standing dead timber from their own woodlots, bucked it into stove-length pieces, and split it by hand with a maul and a wedge. A truckload of seasoned hardwood, mostly oak, hickory, or locust, sold for $15 to $25 in the 1960s, delivered and stacked at the customer's door. The best sellers started cutting in spring, letting the wood season through summer so it burned clean and hot by the time cold weather hit. Regular customers called every year, and a man with a reliable supply and a reputation for honest measure could build a route that kept gas in the truck and food on the table all winter. The work never really disappeared. It just got more expensive and more competitive. A cord of firewood sells for $200 or more today, but the margins are thinner when you factor in the cost of fuel, equipment, and the wear on your spine. When the blackberries came ripe in July, every child in the hollow knew what the next 3 weeks looked like. Families fanned out along fence rows, old logging roads, and abandoned pastures, filling buckets with wild blackberries, huckleberries, and in higher elevations, wild blueberries. Hands turned purple, arms got scratched raw by thorns. Chiggers burrowed into every fold of skin. But a gallon of wild blackberries sold for 50 cents to $1 at the roadside or the general store, and a determined family could pick 5 or 6 gallons a day. Some women turned the berries into jam and preserves, doubling the value in a mason jar, sealed with paraffin wax. Others sold directly to bakeries and restaurants in nearby towns. Berry money was summer money, arriving just when the garden was not yet producing and the pantry shelves were getting thin. The tradition has not entirely vanished. Roadside signs still appear in mountain communities every July, hand-painted on cardboard. Wild blackberries, $3 a quart. But the armies of pickers who once descended on every briar patch have thinned to a handful. Number 8. Making corn shuck items. Nothing got thrown away in an Appalachian household, and corn shucks were no exception. After shucking corn for canning or drying, women saved the clean outer husks, dried them flat, and used them to make dolls, chair seats, doormats, horse collars, and even mattress stuffing. Corn shuck dolls sold for a nickel or a dime at church bazaars and county fairs in the 1940s and 1950s. Small money that added up when you made a dozen at a time. The dolls were faceless by tradition, a detail that gave them an eerie, timeless quality that tourists found irresistible. Braided corn shuck mats and chair seats, bottomed with shucks, lasted for years and cost nothing but time and patience. The craft required no tools beyond scissors and a needle, making it accessible to anyone with a corn patch and steady hands. As plastic goods and factory-made furnishings replaced handmade household items, the demand for corn shuck products faded. Today, corn shuck dolls sell at heritage craft shows for $15 or $20 each. Curiosities from a time when the shuck was as valuable as the corn inside it. Bee gums, hollowed sections of black gum or basswood logs, stood at the edge of gardens and orchards across Appalachia, each one housing a colony that worked the wildflower meadows and tulip poplar groves without being asked. Beekeeping required almost no cash investment in the early days. You cut a log, set it on a flat rock, and waited for a swarm to move in. A single gum could produce 20 or 30 pounds of honey in a good year, dark and complex, with the flavors of sourwood, clover, and whatever else bloomed within flying range. Sourwood honey, specific to the southern Appalachian Mountains, was prized above all others for its light color and buttery taste. A quart jar sold for $1 in the 1950s, and families with a dozen gums could earn enough honey money to cover a month's groceries. Beeswax was valuable too, sold to furniture makers, candle manufacturers, and even the military for waterproofing. Colony collapse and modern agricultural chemicals have made beekeeping harder, but sourwood honey still commands premium prices at farmers' markets. It is proof that some Appalachian side hustles never fully died. A portable sawmill turned standing timber into a paycheck without ever leaving the property. Small operators bought second-hand mills, set them up on flat ground near the timber, and cut lumber to order for neighbors building barns, houses, and fences. The sawyer took a share of the lumber as payment, selling the surplus to lumber yards or directly to builders in town. In the 1950s, rough-cut oak and poplar sold for $40 to $60 per thousand board feet, enough to justify the long days and the constant danger of the blade. The whine of the saw carried for miles through the hollows. a sound as familiar as a rooster crowing. Children stacked slabs and swept sawdust. Wives kept the books and ran water to the crew. A good sawyer with a reliable mill could earn more than a coal miner while staying on his own land and breathing clean air. The trade shrank as large lumber companies consolidated, and building codes demanded kiln-dried, graded lumber that small mills could not certify. But portable sawmills still operate in the mountains, and the men who run them carry on a tradition older than the state lines. Quilting was never just art in the mountains. It was commerce. Women pieced quilt tops from flour sack fabric, worn-out clothing, and fabric scraps traded among neighbors, then stretched the layers over a quilting frame that often dominated the front room for weeks. A finished quilt sold for $5 to $15 in the 1950s, depending on the complexity of the pattern and the fineness of the stitching. Some women took orders from tourists and summer residents who came to the mountains for the cool air and left with a handmade quilt strapped to the roof of their car. Quilting bees served double duty as social gatherings and production lines, with 6 or 8 women stitching a single quilt in a day while catching up on news and gossip. The income was not large, but it was steady and entirely within the woman's control. Money earned at home without asking permission from anyone. When mass-produced bedding filled department stores, the market for handmade quilts shrank to specialty shops and collectors. Today, a hand-quilted Appalachian quilt sells for hundreds or even thousands of dollars at auction. The women who made them for grocery money would be stunned. Number 4. Pulling and selling moss and ferns. The forest floor was a cash register for anyone willing to crawl through it on hands and knees. Sphagnum moss, sheet moss, ground pine, and resurrection ferns were harvested from the deep woods and sold to florists, nurseries, and craft supply companies across the eastern United States. Moss pickers worked in damp, shaded coves where the growth was thickest, peeling sheets of moss from rocks and logs and stuffing them into feed sacks. A 100-pound bale of sphagnum moss sold for $8 to $12 in the 1960s, and a family working together could fill several bales in a day. Ground pine, also called running cedar, was especially popular during the Christmas season for wreaths and garland, and pickers could earn a month's income in the 6 weeks before the holiday. The work was solitary and physically demanding, but it required no equipment beyond a sack and a pair of boots. Over-harvesting and conservation laws have restricted the trade in many areas, but moss and fern gathering still happens quietly in the mountains, an invisible economy that operates mostly in cash and handshake agreements. Number 3, digging wild ginseng. Ginseng was the ultimate Appalachian side hustle, a single root that could be worth more per ounce than the coal beneath it. Wild American ginseng grew in the shaded hardwood coves of the central and southern Appalachians, and the people who knew where to find it guarded their patches with a secrecy that bordered on obsession. A pound of dried wild ginseng root sold for $25 to $40 a pound in the 1960s. By the 1990s, that price had climbed past $300 a pound as demand from Asian markets intensified. Diggers, called seng hunters, walked the mountains with a mattock or a homemade digging stick, reading the forest floor for the plant's distinctive cluster of red berries and 5-pronged leaves. The best hunters could sense ginseng the way a water witch finds a well, something instinctive and unteachable. Families dug together in September when the berries were ripe, replanting the seeds as they went to ensure future harvests. Cash from ginseng bought trucks, paid mortgages, and covered medical bills that insurance would not touch. The trade continues today under strict state regulations, but poaching and habitat loss have thinned the wild populations dramatically. Still, every autumn, men and women walk the same ridges their grandparents walked, eyes on the ground, hoping for that one root shaped like a man that could change the shape of the month. The grist mill was the beating heart of every mountain community, and the man who ran it held a position somewhere between businessman and public servant. Farmers brought sacks of corn on muleback or in the bed of a truck, waited while the stones ground it into meal, and paid the miller with a portion of the grain, usually 1/8 of the total, a tradition called the miller's toll. A busy mill could process 1,000 pounds of corn in a day, and the miller's share added up to a substantial income paid entirely in kind, which he then sold or traded for everything the family needed. The sound of the water wheel turning and the stones grinding was the soundtrack of rural Appalachian life, steady and rhythmic, audible for half a mile downstream. Millers maintained their stones with obsessive care, dressing the grinding surfaces with a special hammer to keep the grooves sharp, a skill that took years to master. When commercial flour mills and supermarkets made factory-ground cornmeal cheap and available, the small mills lost their purpose. Most fell silent by the 1970s. A handful still operate as heritage sites and tourist attractions, grinding corn the old way for visitors who pay $5 for a bag of meal their great-grandparents got for free. Number 1. Moonshining. No list of Appalachian side hustles is complete without the one that built legends, funded families, and kept federal agents employed for the better part of a century. Distilling corn whiskey in the mountains was older than the nation itself, brought over by Scots-Irish settlers, who considered it both a right and a practical necessity. Corn was heavy and cheap, difficult to transport profitably over mountain roads. But a bushel of corn worth 50 cents could be distilled into 2 or 3 gallons of whiskey, worth $3 to $5 a gallon in the 1950s, a transformation that made economic sense in a region where cash was scarce and roads were bad. Moonshiners set their stills in remote hollows near cold, clean water, working at night to avoid the smoke being spotted. The copper pot still, heated over a wood fire, condensed the alcohol into a clear, potent spirit that tasted of corn and oak smoke and something harder to name. Families who ran stills did not consider themselves criminals. They were making a living the same way their grandfathers had, converting a crop into a product the market would bear. The money bought land, built houses, and sent children to school. Revenue agents, called revenuers, played a cat and mouse game with distillers for decades, axing stills and hauling men to court, while communities closed ranks and kept their silence. The trade never completely died. Legal craft distilleries now produce mountain whiskey at premium prices, and the old recipes have come out of the hollows and onto liquor store shelves. But the original moonshiner, working by lantern light with a copper worm and a prayer, operated the most famous side hustle in American history, born from the mountains and never fully tamed. These 20 forgotten side hustles tell the story of a people who refused to go without. When the mine laid off, or the crop failed, or the paycheck did not stretch, Appalachian folks looked at what the land offered and found a way to turn it into money. Ginseng roots, Galax leaves, corn shucks, white oak splits, honey, moss, pelts, and whiskey. None of it was easy. All of it was honest work in the eyes of the people who did it. The mountains provided, and the people had the knowledge to collect. That knowledge is fading now, stored in the memories of grandparents who dug roots and wove baskets and churned butter before the sun came up. But it is not gone. Not yet. Share this with someone who remembers, and drop a comment telling me which side hustle your family ran. I want to hear it, because these were not just ways to make money. They were ways to make a life.